me? And do you see also my presentation? I hope so, yes. So, hello to everybody from Prague today. I would like to say just at the very beginning that I'm really just a historian. I'm not an expert on international law, so please regard my lecture, my paper as such. So a contribution of a historian, not a legal expert. I would like to introduce and to explain the purpose of my lecture with this caricature. And accept. This is a picture from the Italian newspaper Arlecchino from 1848. And you know, I asked very often my friends, family members, and colleagues, what is the focal point of the caricature? And I always got the same answer, the Austrian eagle, which you can see on the right side, which in fact isn't the focal point. Because if you look carefully, you can see that the most important thing in the midst is the inscription, the Treaty of Vienna, 1815. So why is this caricature so important? Because it reveals that the revolutions of 1848, and not only in Italy, were directed also, among others, against the international order, after the Napoleonic Wars. And why actually there was this attack, I mean verbal and even military attack against the order. I would like to reveal in my today's lecture that this attack against the order, post-Napoleonic international order, that the criticism of this order was genuine, sincere, that it wasn't only purpose-built, okay? Because its aim wasn't merely the legitimation of own national interests, for example, the political unity of Germany or Italy. And actually, this criticism, this dislike of the post-Napoleonic international order, and also the existing public law of Europe, resulted actually from the debate about the justice in international relations, international law, diplomatic practice, in short, about a better European states system. In other words, better public law of Europe, which the revolutions in 1848 should introduce, according to the wishes of many Europeans, liberals, even some conservatives, of course, Democrats. And this debate about international justice encompassed people across social and territorial strata of European society. It was very widespread. It surely included, above all, the educated bourgeois and aristocratic classes. But the principal question is, what actually provoked this debate? And it was the rise of the feeling of international insecurity long before 1848. And this feeling of insecurity, again, was caused not by one great war, so military conflict, but by the accumulation of numerous smaller crises and regional conflicts, some of them hardly known today in Europe as well as overseas. And this growth of the feeling of international insecurity has been much neglected, or I would say even ignored, by historians and political, and as far as I know, even legal scholars in the past. So this state of research is all the more surprising, because the same process, this criticism, this dislike of the international order, and this rise of international insecurity led to a parallel tendency in European society, namely the search for state or national security in material force, namely in a large state with strong army, navy, and eventually colonies to win additional resources. I'm again talking about the period before the mid-19th century, not the late part or the decades of the 19th century. So my aim today is to explain this process during the 1830s and 40s, which can perhaps offer some new historical context useful for your research on the history of international law in the 19th century. So let's start with the Congress of Vienna, 1814-1815. It was a generally known attempt to ensure security and peace within the so-called family of European countries and nations. This goal was to be achieved by clearly defined legal engagements and a mutual willingness to settle international disputes in a peaceful way. A quarter century later, so around 1840, however, a considerable number of Europeans felt that the heritage of the Congress was being eroded and that the world was becoming increasingly insecure. And this feeling of insecurity was caused by various reasons, but I want to focus on the affairs in which the great powers violated the public law of Europe, okay? Where they undermined, the great powers undermined their own system they had created after the Napoleonic Wars. So the first affair important in this respect was the French occupation of Ancona in 1832. The French soldiers seized the town of the Papal State against the will of the Pope. So it was the first obvious violation of the public law of Europe, because it was the first violation of a sovereignty of a European country after 1815. The military interventions in Spain, Italy before were always undertaken by some European powers under or with the invitation of the legal authority. This was against the will of the Pope, and it provoked really a strong negative reaction in Europe, especially at the time among diplomats, but also among some liberals in Italy and other countries. I would like to introduce just two examples. For example, this German or Prussian diplomat von Bunsen claimed, "What has happened in Ancona surpasses everything that modern history offers us as examples of injustice and the violation of the law of nations, with the exception of several acts of Napoleon Bonaparte." And Sardinian diplomat Palermo claimed that the silence, and there was the criticism of not only the culprit, France, but also the tacit consentment of the other great powers, which didn't help the Pope, okay, against France. So Palermo claimed that the silence of the European powers in response to the events in Ancona would sanction the right of brutal force and restore things to the same footing as they were during the times of the French Convention, the Directory, or the Empire. By the way, later, even liberals and Democrats, for example, in Italy, criticized the French conduct in 1832. So it wasn't just about the criticism from conservative elites, okay? It later became also as a means of criticism for other groups or political groups of Europeans. There was another important event or conflict. It was the British Sulphur-Napoleon Sulphur War. British-Napoleon Sulphur War in April and May 1840. We have no pictures, no paintings for this event. It was about the British decision to seize Neapolitan vessels, to force the king in Naples, the kingdom of the two Sicilies, to surrender in a commercial dispute. It was about the export of Sicilian sulfur. What is the most important? The British conduct was illegal from the point of view of the public law of Europe. It was generally claimed in Europe at the time. Historians and some legal experts almost unanimously agreed on this, in the 19th and 20th century. And again, this affair, this war, undeclared war, attracted great attention of Europeans, including Germans, Scandinavians, and so on. Again, just some examples. One from the Sardinian diplomat, the Sedivy. Again, it is a very important feature or trait of these affairs. They led to the criticism of not only the conduct of one great power, but the criticism of the whole European state system. I will explain why. So you can see what Sedivy claimed, that this dictatorship that the five great powers have so unjustly appropriated for themselves. It means Britain violating the law and other great powers doing completely nothing. There was no diplomatic support given to the king in Naples, despite the fact that the king asked for diplomatic help. Since that moment, each of them has wanted to make the effects of its predominance felt on the smaller states, and due to their own egotism, it must be said the other governments have remained unconcerned about these injustices and allowed them to happen when they did affect their own interests. And so much so that with each successive president, it is to fear that they have just established the abuse of power by law and will want to exercise this right wherever they will be able to do so with impunity. Again, the criticism of this affair was really widespread in 1840, even, for example, in Germany, Munich, in other cities, in Belgium, I think a little bit. But for example, even among common people, we know from one police report, for example, that in Vienna, this quick and unexpected turn of events, so the British hostile conduct, is greatly regretted because people believe, so the Viennese believe, that this affair forces them to become aware that peace in Europe in no way rests on such a solid basis that it couldn't be unexpectedly shaken by some random event. So, you know, these two events and some others provoke not only some feeling of injustice, international justice, but also a question whether the general peace in Europe would be preserved for long. And now, these affairs like these two provoke a widespread debate about justice and peace in international affairs. We can call this debate geopolitical security debate. And on the turn of the 1830s, the debate encompassed rulers, statesmen, politicians, diplomats, journalists, and other intellectuals, but also some other people, members of the middle class, and even male and female. It is important to add. It was widespread, so you can find these reactions in many European countries. And you can, of course, pose the question, how do I know it? So we have many sources, diplomatic and personal correspondence, police reports for Germany and Austria, books, pamphlets, newspapers, speeches, memoirs, travel books, and so on. So I'm using for my research various primary sources. Now, why the debate was so intensive and widespread? So we have some reasons, okay? For example, the theme, geopolitical themes, were regarded as topical and important for various reasons at the given moment. The theme, geopolitical theme, was acceptable for the conservative, so let's say ruling elites. What I mean, that for example in Austria with limited freedom of speech, it was impossible to debate constitutional issues. But you can read even in Austrian press some commentaries on geopolitical, so international issues. So it was easy for people even in, for example, Austria and Prussia to read and debate on these international affairs. And the theme possessed great potential to unite various political parties. So for example, Giuseppe Mazzini, Cavour, and Carlo Alberto, the king of Piedmont, they would never agree on constitutional issues. But it was easy for them and other conservatives, Democrats, and liberals to agree on international issues connected with the security of Italian countries or all Italy, which was very important later for the rise of Italian nationalism. So just I'm using some simplifications and some examples to explain this very complex topic to you in 55 minutes. So just to add. Now, there was another important impetus for the rise of these debates and, of course, to the international insecurity. First, these affairs I showed you were linked in these debates to overseas affairs. For example, to the Battle of Navarino in 1827. I suppose I don't need to talk about this battle of the Allied forces, British, French, and Russian against the Ottoman in 1827. Then, of course, the French occupation of Algeria, I mean expedition to Algeria in 1830 and afterwards. And for the British Neapolitan Sulphur War, it was very important, this connection with the first British-Chinese Opium War between 1839 and 1842. And now, why this connection with overseas affairs was so important? Because some Europeans thought that the aggressive conduct of some European powers was transferred to Europe itself. So the evaluation of these overseas affairs sometimes change in time. So explain. For example, the Sulphur War was the expression of the British imperialism of free trade. Of course, this term wasn't used at the time, but we use it today. The Opium War was also connected with the so-called imperialism of free trade. And the Europeans said, look, the British are doing to the Chinese the same thing what they are doing to the Neapolitans for the same reason. But what? It's absurd, they said, the Europeans, because you know, the Chinese empire is unprotected by the public law of Europe, while the kingdom of the two Sicilies is protected, or better speaking, should be protected by the public law of Europe. So what would happen to other countries in Europe if the great powers would behave towards these countries in the same way as they behave toward China, or, for example, towards the Opium Empire? I'm sorry, Ottoman Empire. Pardon. Now, you know, for example, the Battle of Navarino was in 1827 regarded by many Europeans as a great thing. You know, it was an expression of fight of civilized Christian Europe against the Muslim barbarous Ottoman Empire. With the occupation of Ancona, this perception, this evaluation, but began to change a little bit, you know, because through the Ancona affair, some Europeans said, you see, now the French are doing to the Pope the same terrible thing what they had done before to the Turks or Ottomans in Navarino or in Algeria. Okay, so now the perception started to change, not always, not among all Europeans, but among some of them. So the most important overseas, we can say, affair or area connected with this geopolitical security debate was, of course, the so-called Eastern question. You know, the relationship of European countries with the Ottoman Empire. And since this decaying empire was regarded as a lion and unprotected by the international public law, it became more easily a prey of the assertive or even aggressive conducts of some European powers. For example, see Algeria. There was one important problem from the European point of view. There was a strong boomerang effect. You know, boomerang comes to you back if you don't hit the kangaroo. When the great powers competition in the Near East influenced, often in a very negative way, the situation in Europe in itself. Okay, don't forget the Crimean War in the 1850s. And the best example of this boomerang effect for our time, before 1848, was the Rhine crisis. I'm pretty sure that you Belgians know it, because this crisis played a very important role in your debates about your neutrality, okay, of the Belgian kingdom. And the Rhine crisis was a product of the Eastern question in late 1840, because there was a dispute between France and other European powers about the solution of one war within the Ottoman Empire. And this conflict was moved in a political way to Europe. And the Rhine crisis served as a war inside crisis. Okay, many Europeans thought that the war, general war, was inevitable in Europe, which contributed to the rise of insecurity and the rise of the growth of geopolitical security debates in European society in late 1840. Finally, it didn't end in war, the crisis, but it was always remembered as a warning, as some kind of threat. Now, I will mention the peace movement little bit later, but this is just one expression for all. The herald of peace, the British general, you know, of the peace movement, wrote in January 1841, the relationships of the different countries of the civilized world at the present time are very far from being such as the true friend of peace can look upon with pleasure. And not only the Rhine crisis, but also other affairs were mentioned, for example, the Opium War or the British-American disputes at that time. But this is, you know, we have many examples, not only within the peace movement, when Europeans share this opinion. Now, you know, Europe in 1840, in late 1840, witnessed armaments as well as intensive debates about peace and justice in international affairs owing to the Rhine crisis. One example for all, the debate about the practical value of perpetual neutrality of Belgium, and the same debate existed in Switzerland. Regarding the mistrust of the existing international order, a great number of men and women agreed that it would be foolish to rely only on the treaties. So there were appeals for armament, so armed neutrality, and even for allies. So the Belgians and the Swiss armed in late 1840 or prepared themselves for defense. And in Belgium, some intellectuals were for France, so they said we need French alliance to remain sovereign. But some Belgians claimed, no, we need to support the alliance of the German Confederation. And there even were those both in Belgium and the Netherlands who advocated the alliance of both small kingdoms, countries, which was surprising given the strained relations at that time. Don't forget, you divorced the Dutch and the Belgians in 1839, definitely. And now, a year later, some of your predecessors contemplated mutual alliance, Dutch-Belgian alliance. And by the way, you have many pamphlets, so we have many evidence for the debate about neutrality, even in your parliament in Brussels, so in Belgium. You see one for many, where the author of this De la Belgique en cas de guerre wrote that the neutrality doesn't gain friends nor reconcile enemies. And he wrote, the history of neutralities is in general nothing other for the small countries than a long series of deceptions, too often covered in blood, and neutrality will be almost always disastrous for them. So this led this author to seek some foreign alliance with stronger European power. So just one example for all. But there was also another important ground for this intensity and of the geopolitical security debates in Europe. It was linked to the past. Because in Belgium, for example, in other countries during the Rhine crisis, the violations of the international law and neutralities in the past were often remembered, especially, just two examples for all, the British bombardment of Copenhagen in 1807, it's the big picture, and the destruction of the independent Venetian Republic 10 years earlier. And you can find also these memories, for example, I think in this pamphlet and many other political writings around 1840 and later. So it was about the causes or grounds for these geopolitical security debates, the criticism of the international order, the mistrust of international justice, or mistrust of European powers, and the rise of international insecurity. Now, there was a practical outcome about this of these debates. The search for international security and justice. Okay, so some ways how to improve the situation, where to find some kind of remedy. And now, again, I must offer some simplification. So, the search for international security and justice can be divided into two sorts of plans. The first, plans compatible with the post-Napoleonic international order, and then the plans more or less incompatible with the order, so changing it fundamentally. For the first group, you can find, for example, Metternich's suggestion for the League to preserve peace in Europe in 1840, something like proto-North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Really, I'm not exaggerating. You know, it's forgotten plan, but very interesting. Then traditional alliances among European countries, okay, among rulers or governments. Then the peace movement. It was more or less compatible because you had some ideas within the peace movement where the adherents of the peace movement wanted to change, you know, the international order more fundamentally. But, you know, the peace movement in Europe was on rise since 1840. And the explanation is simple because the Europeans, especially the Europeans, reacted to international affairs of that time. You know, the appeals for something new or something more stable in Europe, international order, so was always supported with the memories of the current affairs or overseas affairs or the past affairs. I mean, international affairs. And there also were these ideas of perpetual and armed neutrality. So in Belgium, Switzerland, we have some perpetual neutrality acknowledged, recognized by European powers, but we cannot trust the powers. So we want to remain neutral, but if we want to remain neutral, we must be strong. So we must be ready to defend ourselves by the force of arms. So now we have the second sort of plans incompatible with the post-Napoleonic order. Important information for you, these plans weren't invented only by liberals and Democrats, okay? You can find also the deflection from the loyalty to the post-Napoleonic international order in the conservative camp. So the readiness to wage wars, to conquer territories, to become more secure, I mean geopolitically secure. The best example can offer Carlo Alberto, the king of Piedmont. It was the king who began the first war in Europe, I mean among European countries who signed the Treaty of Vienna, so not the Ottoman Empire. So he started the war against Austria in March 1848, this ruler. And what happened in his case, we can reveal in the 1830s, so before the Rhine crisis. What happened was that the great powers' illegal exploitation or assertive exploitation of power remaining unpunished, for example, the French occupation of Ancona, led to Piedmont, so we can say Carlo Alberto's mistrust of the sufficiency of the European state system to protect the small states' sovereign rights. It was also about the principle of non-intervention introduced by France at the time, you know, so the theory about the limited sovereignty of small countries bordering with France, something like Brezhnev doctrine from the 20th century, which provoked negative reaction of some rulers in Italy and Germany. Then what followed from, for example, Piedmont or from Carlo Alberto were the futile efforts to improve the system through more binding treaty guarantees. So the Italian rulers and diplomats and politicians said, please, great powers, you see now the peace is threatened at the beginning of the 1830s. Prepare or offer some more binding rules for us, for you, to protect our weak countries and to ensure stable peace and some relations. Of course, it was the perspective of conservatives, okay? Then, when the great powers did nothing, so the loyalty to the system decreased. We can see it by Carlo Alberto already during the first half of the 1830s. Then Carlo Alberto was ready to proceed outside this political legal system. So he, for example, proposed in 1832-33 a preventive war against France. Then also Carlo Alberto placed greater emphasis on the use of military force at the expense of those who were regarded as weak. So Carlo Alberto introduced many reforms of his army and navy in the 1830s, and he was preparing for defense and war later against Austria, because he wanted to seize all northern Italy to make his kingdom, Piedmont, greater. It means more powerful and it means more safe, which finally led to war against Austria in 1848. So this example is documented in one of my articles. This change of mind, this change of the attitude of Carlo Alberto and his entourage, so advisors and diplomats before 1840. So then, of course, you have the plans of German liberals and Democrats. So to change the German Confederation, to change the map of Italy, to unite or unify Germany or Italy. So you have these various nationalist designs. It means it, of course, went against the post-Napoleonic order as it had been introduced at the Congress of Vienna. Then you have the Scandinavian movement for the very same reason, also on the rise, being on the rise since 1840 in reaction to the Eastern question, to the Rhine crisis, and then to the Schleswig-Holstein question. And all these issues were, please note, interconnected. And now, yes, slide 30. Now, the significance of this of these geopolitical security debates in the 1840s laid in several aspects. First, they helped to formulate political programs of various political and national groups. Second, they justify the colonial and imperialistic policies in Germany in the 1840s as well as in Italy. And third, they contributed to the formation of national consciousness. So, for example, in Italy, you know, the people in Naples and in Piedmont, they weren't connected even in culture and language. But by 1848, they were connected through their mistrust of the international order, through their mistrust of the great powers, not only Austria, and the readiness to become more safe through the creation of Italian Confederation. The Italian Confederation was the predominant idea of Italian patriotism or nationalism during the 1840s, not one unified Italian kingdom. Now, the power-oriented nationalist movements probably is the most striking reaction to the feeling of insecurity. They contained the danger of bellicosity, although it was primarily this power orientation, a defensive response to the state of international politics. So the Germans and Italians often claimed, and we can trust them, that they were preparing for defensive war, okay, under the motto civis pacem para bellum. You can find it in Italian and German press, and not only in the press, but if you read personal correspondence and diaries in many years, okay, during the 1840s, you see how some personalities came to this attitude in their reactions to international affairs, to the misuse of power by the great powers and the violations of international law, or by the proceedings which were regarded as such, as violations of international law. Because the whole issue is not only about what actually happened or what actually threatened people or nations and states, but also what was regarded as threats and violations of law. So there were many rumors, but they also played important role in this rise of international insecurity. Now, the rise of insecurity, these geopolitical debates about justice and peace were widespread in Europe, but the most important, or the most widespread, they were in small countries like Italian countries, German countries, or Scandinavian countries, where the inhabitants felt encircled by security threats. Okay. So in Germany, it was very strong. You know, this feeling of encirclement from the German Empire at the beginning of the 20th century. But something very similar on the small scale had already existed during the 1840s in Germany, in Scandinavia, or in Italy. Now, I simplified the topic. I divided the plans: power-oriented, incompatible with the system, and some compatible with the system. I said that some people try to find salvation in material power, and some people try to search salvation in normative approach. So, for example, in the peace movement. However, this division is not entirely correct. What was very typical for all these ideas was that at the same moment, by the same men or women, there usually were, if we don't talk about the adherents of the peace movement, but for example, nationalists, there were the both tendencies. So to improve own security through material power, so unity, army, and so on, but at the same moment, to ensure better international law, I mean better international order. Because the Germans or Italians or Scandinavians claimed, we must become, we Germans, for example, more powerful against France, against Britain, against Russia. But even if we become more powerful, it will not ensure, you know, peaceful world and friendly relations among European nations. So then we need some kind of fraternity, you know, legal, political. So even two ardent nationalists, we can say chauvinists, but I don't like this term, like German nationalist Johann Gustav Droysen and the Danish adherent of the Scandinavian movement, Orla Lehmann. These two men who really were fighting against each other in the Schleswig-Holstein question. Both men claiming that Germany or Scandinavia had to be more united and more powerful. Both men really strongly supported the idea of the transformation or the reform of the public law of Europe and the European international system. That's why, for example, in the German National Assembly in Frankfurt am Main in 1848, both issues were discussed. So the new territory of the German Empire, naval and land armament, and so on. But on the other hand, also how to make Europe more peaceful, how to ensure peaceful coexistence of various nations. So you can see that these two tendencies were somehow incompatible, not compatible, but they really existed one next to each other. Which also finally, as I will show at the end or explain, this bet on the force of arms, this inclination to realism precluded the realization of the idea which we can call more normative. So it means this legal, international legal change in the post-Napoleonic international order. Now, this tendency to become strong, almost empire, to have colonies and unity, but on the other hand, to improve the international legal system is particularly strong in Italy, in Italian national movement. And also the Italian patriots and nationalists in the 1840s, with these two goals, reacted not only to the threat which allegedly represented Austria, but to the situation that was regarded in Italian society or part of a society as the decline of the post-Napoleonic order, or the inability or inability of this order to ensure stable peace and justice. So you probably know the famous Italian patriot Vincenzo Gioberti, who published in 1843 his famous work on the moral and civil primacy of the Italians. And we can trace how the Rhine crisis, for example, influenced Gioberti in his national ideas, so the idea of Italian confederation, as well as negative estimation of the post-Napoleonic order. He himself not only wrote his work in Brussels, but he had also witnessed this crisis, so the debates about the Rhine crisis and Belgian neutrality. By the way, Gioberti always claimed after this experience that neutrality will not help the Italians to be safe. Okay, something some Belgians also claimed during the 1840s. Just to see how much Gioberti reacted to this international insecurity, you can see from the titles of two chapters from Primato, the constant state of anarchy and war in present-day Europe, and the necessity of an Italian alliance for the security and prosperity of Italy. And I can offer one quotation. You can I will read it, moment. Now it's from Primato. You can find many quotations like this there. Europe, which continually speaks of good order, law and peace, is in a state of anarchy and continuous rancor, and doesn't have rights of the people except for meaningless and deceptive shadow. The laws governing people, as taught and practiced from the time of Grotius to our known, can be compared to that of duelists. They cannot kill each other, except according to certain rules, and approach each other, speaking quietly, before reaching for their pistols or their swords. In this way, the law, which links nations, governs only truces and battles, and venerates that state of war, which certain philosophers agreeably call this a state of nature. It, war, is inevitably in the present condition. So it was, and now you can find that from Cesare Balbo, Massimo D'Azeglio, and Camillo Cavour, so moderate Italian patriots, moderate liberals, to Giuseppe Mazzini, so radical Republican Democrat, these people share the same negative estimation of the order, and last but not least, also the King Carlo Alberto. And it would be a serious mistake to see in the application of nationhood, so the way to use Italian nationality to ensure unity of Italian countries, to ensure greater security of the countries, merely a purpose-built measure. It really primarily resulted from the long conviction that the post-Napoleonic order was unjust, which made some contemporaries believe that it couldn't then be provisory. And already in 1847, for example, some of them thought and hoped that it was coming to an end. And though the visions of both groups were often so vague that it is difficult to make a distinction between them, I mean Democrats and liberals, they were unambiguously united in their emphasis on the so-called right of nations, including such a realist statesman as Cavour, who became a resolute champion of the principle of nationality. This principle was to be used as a new foundation in the reorganization of the relations among European countries, or better said, nations. A nation was to become a basic element of the new system. Of course, Carlo Alberto didn't go so far in his contemplations. He was more conservative, but these men did, and they did also many other Italians and Germans and Scandinaves, or people in the north. By the way, Gioberti is known for his readiness to use Catholic religion to unite the Italians, but it is less known that he wanted to use Christianity to unite European nations in the same way, to ensure peace and justice in their mutual relations. So you see now the reasons why the topic of international injustice, justice, law, and so on became so frequent in Italian public discourse before 1848, and not only in Italy, but Italy I'm using just an example because of my latest monograph. You can see just some, quotations from the press from 1847 or 8. A new era is already beginning. That of 1815 is closed. We want peace, but a peace founded on the solid basis of laws and justice. A peace that favors trade and international relations. Or the brutal principle of power has dominated European law. Secondary countries, so small countries, have had to seek refuge under tyrannical wings of the great powers. Now that the rule of these treaties is over, it was this optimism of the, so to speak, spring of nations in 1848. The European cataclysm of 1848 has consequently needed to recognize the inalienable rights of individuals and of nations to govern themselves. Just to emphasize one fact, if you look at pamphlets and newspapers in Italy, 1847, when the freedom of press was gradually introduced in Italian countries, you see that usually the first articles in the newspapers started with geopolitical topics. The question of constitutions, okay, and inner modernity and modernization, okay, was also important, but it didn't serve as the primary argument on behalf of Italy's unity. So it was the problem of geopolitics, external security. By the way, Cavour or Balbo, Azeglio or Gioberti, they incline to use this Italian kingship, this Italian patriotism, for in the first place, in the same way as Carlo Alberto did in 1848. So to increase the security of Piedmont. Okay, Piedmontese patriotism was more important for these persons than some, ephemeral Italian identity. It was the same issue like for Bismarck and some Prussians later in the 19th century. Okay, Prussia's policy before Germany's unification was motivated by regards for own Prussian security, and of course Prussia's dominance in Germany served this purpose well. So Bismarck connected Prussia's aims with, so to speak, so-called German aims. So there was a huge debate in 1847, 1848 about new international law, about the law of nations, and so on, which finally, as you know, probably you legal experts, ended, but it didn't start, but it ended in the famous lecture of Pasquale Stanislao Mancini in 1851 in Turin, della nazionalità come fondamento del diritto delle genti. For legal experts, this is the beginning of the introduction of the law of nations in science. I think in legal science, as far as I understand that. But please regard it also as a climax of a peak of the tendency in Italian society already before. And don't forget that the texts on international law around 1848 also were written by other lawyers in Italy, like normal lawyers, not only at universities, but also advocates, so people with legal education. So you can see that by 1848, there was a strong tendency in European society to solve a problem that was regarded as serious and topical. It was the insecurity, international insecurity linked to the insecurity of all countries, own communities, all nations. There were some, ideas how to overcome this erosion of the post-Napoleonic international order. We can divide these ideas in two ways: power-oriented and, let's say, legal or political legal, pan-European. What finally happened was that the bet or the failure of the introduction of new international order in the mid-19th century finally led to the bet on material power in Germany, in Italy. And even if many nationalists and patriots, even in the late 19th century, for example, Francesco Crispi in Italy, the famous imperialist advocating colonial policy and armament, even these people wished to establish some new order. Crispi claimed we should imitate United States and to have the United States in Europe. They, at the same moment, it was Gilles Ferry in France, Salisbury in Britain, Francesco Crispi in Italy, and so on. At the same moment, they claimed, we would like to do it. We know that without this new legal framework, without some European unity and so on, we will never have stable legal system, justice, and peace. But because of the animosities, mistrust among European countries and nations, it is not an appropriate period to introduce or to work on some better Europe from political and legal point of view. So that's all from me. I see I had 15 minutes, so fine. So thank you very much for your attention. I hope that you were able to hear me, to understand me. And now Professor D'Hondt can moderate the questions if you have any. Thank you.
Thank you very much, dear colleague, for your fascinating talk. That reminds me of reading your incredibly rich and nuanced assessment based on almost countless sources of these decades in European international relations that are often not assessed in their contextual dimensions by legal historians. And we often tend to limit our studies to published treaties or to works from doctrine, or in the worst case, to the image that has been constructed decades after. But you managed to recreate the pulpant uncertainty and the discontent with the Vienna Congress system that was real in the 1830s and 1840s. And certain histories, for instance, of our own international status tend to retro-project a peaceful image of institutional organization that has been created in the 20th century, but in reality, of course, uncertainty and security threats were suscitating all kinds of other alternative strategies that you've beautifully mapped. I would not want to monopolize the word, and I am sure that many colleagues in this audience, and my thanks, of course, again to everybody for assisting to this talk, will have suggestions or questions. You can raise your hand through the hand modus in Teams if you request the floor. Voilà. Whoever has asked the question, Florence, voilà, can take the floor. Florence. So first Florence Volkaert and then Raphael Kain, who also raised his hand. And then Wouter de Rijke, but we don't hear Florence for the moment.
Yeah, sorry, I forgot to unmute myself, the typical mistake with online meetings. No, thanks for a fascinating lecture. It was very interesting. And with respect to neutrality, I have a question. As far as I understood from what you were saying is that the guarantees given by the great powers were not really a credible commitment in terms of enforcement, so that if it really came down to it, the great powers would not intervene in favor of a permanent neutral countries such as Belgium or Switzerland. The reason I'm asking is because I've been sitting on a draft of a paper for almost a year now, and one of the things I'm not quite able to figure out is whether the guarantee given by the great powers was a credible commitment or no, whether it's a form of cheap talk where they're just making some sort of vague commitment that they are not intending to carry out, or whether they are actually engaging in a certain cost for themselves, and that they will that they are trying to put out a signal that they will enforce the rights of neutrals in case necessary. Thanks.
May I react now? I would like to react to each question if it's possible.
Of course.
So thank you for it. Well, there were two issues. The guarantees, I mean, as very officially, agreed and signed, promised. And here, of course, you are experts on Belgian neutrality. To be frank, I didn't see the treaty with the guarantees, or I don't remember it now. So I think that probably there was written, Professor Don would know it, that the great powers obliged to defend Belgian neutrality in the case of an attack, I suppose. I think that in Switzerland, it was already given 1850. But the most important issue from my point of view isn't whether the guarantees were given, in a way when the great powers were really committed to defend the country, which I think in the Belgian case they were, but you must know it better than me. The most important issue is that the people in Europe, in Belgium, didn't trust the great powers. The people in Switzerland didn't trust the great powers. They didn't trust that even if the great powers had committed themselves to defend the neutrality of small countries like Belgium or Switzerland, that they would finally come to help if these countries were attacked. And second issue, during the Rhine crisis, the French government, we can accept the neutrality of Belgium probably, but it's difficult to accept the neutrality of Switzerland, because if we want to wage war against Austria, we must go to Italy. So either attack Piedmont or go over Switzerland. And this was debated not only in France or Switzerland, but all over Europe, because these debates, these issues are interdependent. Okay, it wasn't about debate that in Belgium people discuss own neutrality, but this debate in Belgium was reprinted and discussed also in other countries. So there was a growth of mistrust that the great powers were ready to meet their legal obligations. And for example, Sweden, during the Iran crisis, Sweden, Norway, wanted to be neutral during a war among European powers if the war had broken out. The problem was that Russia and Britain, the cabinets, pressed Sweden to say we would commit ourselves to fight in war against France. So there was a very strong pressure. So the people in Europe, they saw, because it became known, that if the moment arrived and war broke out, the treaties, the value of treaties and obligations and promises would be null. So some Europeans tried to prepare for such a situation. So even if you had some obligations clearly defined and blah, 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 the problem was that people in Europe didn't trust these obligations. Some of them, not all of them, of course, some of them, because of their experiences from the 1830s, 1840s, and they linked these experiences with the past. For example, the destruction of the Venetian Republic in 1797 was very often remembered also in the text from Belgium, which I saw. So is it the answer to your question?
Yes, very much. The perception amongst statesmen and the people more generally is what I was most interested in. So it's very clear. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. And may I add something, Professor John, because you have time? You know, this feeling of insecurity was strong, that it reached so absolute proportion that in the Netherlands during the Rhine crisis, the Netherlands wanted to be neutral because they have financial problems and they didn't know why they should fight against France or Germany. The problem was that they said, some Dutch, you know, if we fight against France, okay, but probably Belgium would ally with France and the French army would come first and we would be defeated before the Germans and Austrians and Russians come to our aid. The problem was that many Dutch said, if we side with France or if we remain neutral, then Britain would be upset and the British would seize Java. And the island of Java was economically absolutely crucial. It was absolutely important for the Netherlands in the 1840s because the financial situation in the Netherlands was very, very bad. But still, the Dutch really feared that even if they had remained neutral, Britain would punish them by the occupation of Java, which actually Palmerston privately had contemplated several years before. But I think that the Dutch didn't know that. Okay. So you see the proportion of mistrust, which we can say was absurd. It was baseless. But, you know, it doesn't matter. It played role in the rise of this insecurity, and it played role in the creation of political and national programs. I don't say that in the Netherlands, but for example, in Italy or Germany, it did. Pardon, it was just some point.
Okay, then the next question is from Raphael Cahen, who is a guest lecturer at the Vrije Universiteit Brussels and for the moment in residence as a fellow at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Orléans. Raphael?
Yes, so thank you very much for your lecture. I think last time we saw us was probably in 2015 in Vienna. I don't remember exactly, but I really much enjoyed your lecture. I have a question because it's actually very, very broad. Of course, your topic, because as you said, those geopolitical security debates are everywhere in Europe, discussed by journalists, by diplomats, by agents of foreign affairs ministry, or so I was wondering if you are like studying every country, every newspapers, or if you have some kind of more precise limit to your sources, or if you focus on more some countries, or really do the broad European perspective.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Of course, I must narrow my focus. So Professor don't know that I have now written the book on Italy. So Italy, it was the field at this period, 1830s, 1840s, covered by my research. So for Italy, I tried to go from the north to the south, to visit archives and to research journals, newspapers, as much as I could from all political groups. So I have probably 80 newspapers from all Italy for 2 years, you know, and some other newspapers in Europe and other sources, because you cannot just bet on newspapers. So you must have other sources which I mentioned: primary, personal correspondence, diaries, political correspondence, everything you can find, even cultural sources, even poetry can help. However, as I'm writing in the introduction in my book, you can, in my opinion, you can never understand this process if you just focus on one country. So you must apply this transnational approach. So for comparison, the best milieu is Germany. And I have been engaged with German history in this respect for many years, because I published in 2017-16 a book on the Rhine crisis in IB Torres. And I revealed at the time this big debate. So for many years, whenever I could in Germany and Europe, I try to win as many sources as possible. So it is about collecting various kinds of primary sources, of course, reading literature, but it doesn't help so much because I never saw this topic, you know, in scholarly literature. Probably it's an arrogant remark. So if you saw anything like that, please tell me. But also I try to see the situation in Scandinavia, because you have these three processes of unity: Italy, Germany, and Scandinavia. So I can understand a little bit Danish. So I visited the archives in Stockholm and Copenhagen. I tried to read as much in various languages on Scandinavian movement and read some published sources from Scandinavians in German, French, and so on. But of course, I try to deal with Switzerland, especially issue with Belgium, and I was in the archives in Brussels, in The Hague, and also I'm trying to reveal these debates in France, for example, in Britain. The nature was a little bit different, but also the feeling of insecurity was there, despite the fact that the French July monarchy was much stronger than Italian countries and so on. And then I'm trying now to get to the United States for Fulbright, because what I'm now mentioning for Europe, we have the same interdependency, the security debate in an transatlantic sphere. So the United States and Europe, so manifest destiny in American history, American expansion. So again, I'm trying to sort the sources to, you know, I focused on Italy, so I could work with Italian sources intensively for some years, but at the same moment, during the same time, I must collect and do the research from the wider perspective. But of course, I didn't read so many newspapers on Germany. And of course, you must make selections, especially for Germany. So, because in Italy, you had the freedom of press for 2 years. I used some older newspapers, governmental also before 1847, but for Germany, for Southern Germany, you have so many newspapers. If you want to cover the period of 20 years, you must have some selection. So I know I'm talking too long, it's finished. I hope that I answered your question.
Rafael?
No, yeah, thank you. Thank you. It's really impressive. It's really impressive how broad you managed to, and I think it's true that it's most interesting, the transnational aspect of this. So yeah, thank you very much again.
The next orator is Wouter de Rijke, who is editor-at-large of Standen and Landen, so who is in charge of our communication together with Maxime Jotran and soon Julien Delattre. For our blog and our Facebook page. And he happens to be working on the transnational peace movement before 1870. So I have an idea of what the question might be.
Hello, thank you for this very interesting lecture. I've been reading your books as of late, and I thought them very helpful to help contextualize my own research. They're very interesting. I have some question regarding your mention of the peace movements, obviously. You said on your slide that they were more or less compatible with the post-Napoleonic system. So I was wondering if you could perhaps elaborate on that. And perhaps to help you with that, I think we can split it thematically and geographically. Because thematically, I think two major aspects of the peace campaign on a legal level were mandatory arbitration on the one hand and a Congress of Nations on the other hand. All these utopian ideas of international organization. How would you say, do these two ideas, to what extent are they congruent with the post-Napoleonic system? For instance, a Congress of Nations often had support for the sovereign equality of states, support for the nationality principle. It also had links with Kantian ideas of republics. And on the other hand, geographically, the peace movement was transnational, but they were rooted in their own states. Where was the peace movement most congruent with the post-Napoleonic order? For instance, the British peace movement was dominated by Quakers who were vehemently in favor of disarmament and even prohibitions on defensive wars, the most radical ones. So could you elaborate more on that, perhaps?
Okay. Well, as for the peace movement, for example, for me, the arbitration, the idea, as sometimes proposed, didn't mean, the crucial change in the European state system. For example, Metternich with his League to Preserve Peace also proposed some kind of arbitration. But of course, this arbitration belonged to the decision-making of governments and rulers, and then within the peace movement, it was the idea that who would be the arbitress, okay? But still, I think that the arbitration or the ideas of some cooperation wouldn't mean a big stroke or I will say change in the structure of European politics after 1815. But you had some really far-reaching ideas. This European Parliament, where some nations would be represented. In Britain, you also had this People's International League, John Bowring, Mazzini, in reaction to the annexation of Krakow. So some ideas, some pamphlets, because there were some competitions also, Bada and so on, if I remember it well. So they were really more far-reaching, and I think that the acceptance of these ideas on international level would really mean a strong change in the system of international relations or some shift. So, but to be frank, I didn't saw these ideas. It is how I read them and I understood them. By the way, when I read The Herald of Peace or some primary sources I found, you had the adherents in Germany, some groups which are not well known because the peace movement in the 1840s, before 1848, it was primarily seated in Europe, in Britain. I agree, okay? Probably Switzerland also another source. But when some adherents of the peace movement traveled in Germany, they found some groups of people and they inclined to this idea. But I think that their way of thinking was more conservative, not so far-reaching, But to be frank, I still want to find some resources on Germany in this respect. And there is a long way. I just know that there was some reaction of some groups visited by some, let's to speak, agents of the peace movement sent in the mid-1840s to Europe, something as far as I know, okay? But so it is what I mean, that within the peace movement there were some opinions, some ideas. Some were more compatible with the post-Napoleonic international order, and it is also why, for example, the peace movement, some British sent some ideas and letters to Louis Philippe, to Frederick William IV. There were these connections. I don't know whether they are described by historians, but these connections, attempts to influence rulers and diplomats, and I think that these ideas were let's say, more compatible with the existing state of things. And there are more far-reaching ideas, and it would be really, if fulfilled, if executed, it would mean really a strong change in the public law of Europe and the system of European politics. It is as far as I can understand it. Probably you don't agree, like me, and I will be happy for your feedback. And if you can send me some of your works text, I will be much happy.
Oh, thank you. It's very interesting. I actually have written an article specifically about Louis Barras, so I could send you to it sometime. But I'm sure we can send emails, so perhaps we can go to the next speakers. But it's very interesting. I'm very fascinated by your books. They're a breath of fresh air, I think, when it comes to international legal history in their contextual aspects. So thank you for answering my question.
I just one point. Probably, I don't know how you regard people like Frenchmen. I think Michel Chevalier and so on. They were writing at the time of the Rhine crisis or later the books, some Frenchmen pamphlets on peaceful future of Europe, but they also wanted to have peaceful Europe with French leadership, you know. But I think that Michel Chevalier was a member of the peace movement at the same moment. Or some people I know, probably I would have to like, because really my problem is that I go through many sources or books, and now I have everything in my computer, but sometimes I forget the names and so on. I'm getting older. I'm much older than you, so you know my memory is not so good as yours. So some people, some pamphlets. So I don't know whether you regard these Frenchmen around 1840 and later advocating peace in Europe, but with the prominent role of France as the adherents of the peace movement. But I think they were, but they had different point, different idea how to enter Europe. They were a little bit, you know, French patriots as well.
Yes, I'm still investigating the French peace movement, so that's actually what I'm going to investigate the next months. I'm still in my PhD research, although I do notice that national backgrounds do influence their ideas. For instance, there was a Genevan Peace Society, and the winning prize essay of that organization in the 1830s was won by a German-speaking professor in Switzerland. He was actually born in Germany and would return to Germany. And he said the German Confederation would constitute the core of a future European Confederation. So obviously giving much preeminence to the German sphere. Obviously, the Frenchmen were also accused of many ideas of peace friends laid an emphasis on an Anglo-French alliance, for instance, as the core of a European confederacy or as the driving motor of the reforms they wanted to see. But these are all aspects that I'm still investigating, of course. So, but I'm happy to email you about this, accompanying my article about Bara.
Thank you. I would say, please, you must do it. Please, must send it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Do we have any further questions or suggestions or comments for our distinguished invited speaker? If no further hands are raised, I would like to add a small side note to the very reverential attitudes that you demonstrate towards lawyers and legal texts, in the sense that when you suggest that the precise nature of the obligations of the guarantors of Belgium's permanent neutrality would be drafted in a very specific way, that is not really the case. In Article 7 of the Treaty of London of April 1839 is very vague. And the whole exercise of the Belgian government in reaction to the Orange crisis is trying to interpret this vague phrasing into a workable legal framework. And this mission is conferred not to a professor of law, but to a professor in the Faculty of Arts in Leuven, Wilhelm Arendt, Guillaume Arendt in Francicized form. Arendt goes to the classical doctrine of 18th century Law of Nations and to the 19th century works that are available to him, and he tries to distinguish why the ad hoc obligations of a voluntary neutral power, namely impartiality and abstention, how these two main obligations look like when they are being made permanent. A permanently neutral country loses the one advantage of voluntary neutrality, namely that you can put an end to it when you want. And Arendt tries to, one, convince that Belgium is distinct from all the cases you cited, and reading your book has inspired me to see really the relevance of all those references to Switzerland, to Venice, to Krakow. Arendt tries to prove that, as we lawyers call it, Belgian neutrality is ad hoc, and sui generis. It's a sui generis situation that should be distinguished from the other previous cases of voluntary or permanent neutrality, because he fears that it will not be taken seriously enough. And one of the most inspiring quotes on that is to be found in your dissertation on the Eastern Question, where Metternich thinks that permanent neutrality is a way to suggest that the state is not fully sovereign, and that the guarantors can dictate its foreign policy, that he confuses, one could say confused, but I don't know if you can really use that term in view of the zeitgeist, where he confuses a protectorate and a permanently neutral country. So that is one aspect. So discarding any kind of similarity with situations that can be perceived as being weak. And the other one is trying to open a boulevard for trade with everybody. But unfortunately, it takes two to tango. So to open a market in the 19th century, before the Cobden Chevalier Treaty, before the 1850s, 1860s, you need the consent of the bigger markets. And the French nor the Zollverein will willingly sacrifice their own interest in opening their markets to Belgium. And this precarity that is clearly behind such a standard legal treatise as the Essai sur la neutralité permanente de la Belgique is exemplified and contextualized to a very high level in your work, and that makes it really a necessary complement to the previous more national case studies that we had. I think somebody left us a chat message. Our colleague Klaas van Gelder has had to leave us. He's our treasurer of our society. And he leaves a warm message to the speaker.
May I react?
Of course.
What you said. Just, you know, this Metternich's idea that a country placed under protectorate, he reacted to the French idea from 1839 to ensure, you know, the future of the Ottoman Empire by placing the Ottoman Empire under the protectorate of European powers. As, for example, Greece had been already protected. And for Metternich, you know, it was the problem, because to place a country under protectorate, from his point of view, was to deprive it from sovereignty, because the protectorate interfered with internal affairs of such a country, like the British, French, and Russians did in Greece since 1832. So I think it was just a special case why Metternich raised this protest and said, no, if we want to ensure the future of the Ottoman Empire, we must introduce the Ottoman Empire into the family of European nations with the full equality. So it means with the same rights and the same duties like a legal partner, two partners. But to place it under a protectorate, it's like a semi-colonial status, we would say today. Just why I think that he didn't offer the example of Belgium when he was fighting against this French idea of protectorate over the Ottoman Empire. But this is just a historical remark to explain Metternich's point of view.
Yes, well, we have edited correspondence of the Austrian ambassador in Brussels, published in the 1920s by Alfred de Ridder, where we see the Austrian insistence on intervening in the Belgian defense policy. For instance, that Metternich raises the interests of the German Confederation to prevent the construction of fortresses in the north or in the east, northeast of the country. He sees this as a threat to the security policy of the German Confederation, and shows a willingness, I would say, to intervene with decisions that should normally be restricted to the perimeter of a country's sovereignty.
Yeah. Okay.
Are there any further questions or remarks? Well, in that case, I can only thank you very warmly again for a beautiful talk, and we are all looking forward to the final publication of your monograph with the Austrian Academy of Sciences. Forgive me for omitting to mention your book on the Rhine crisis. My apologies, it had slipped my mind in preparing for the presentation of your lecture. Thank you very much for this connection between Prague and Belgium. We only lost the audio for a couple of seconds, so I think that everything has gone perfectly on the material side as well. Thank you very much. And also the warmest thanks to all members of Standen and Landen, Anciens et Assemblées d'État, and the external auditors who were so kind as to sacrifice part of their time to join us and listen.
Okay. Goodbye. Goodbye to everybody.
Thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your evening.
I will.